Hello and welcome to today's PIR live event webinar brought to you by Partners in Research Canada. My name is Stacey Joyce and I will be your host. Please remember that anytime throughout the presentation or the Q&A section of this webinar, if you're joining us live, you can click chat in the top left-hand corner of your screen. Make sure you change the to fields to all panelists and attendees and type out your question and send it in, and we'll be sure to relay that when it is time to do so. If you let us know where the question is coming from, a particular student's name, or perhaps the school name or the city that you're joining us from, we would love to give you a shout out. So it is now my pleasure to introduce Maxime Chouinard. He is the curator at the Museum of Healthcare in Kingston, Ontario. Thank you so much for joining us. I will let you take it away.
Thank you, Stacey. So as you were told, my name is Maxime Chouinard. I am the curator at the Museum of Healthcare here in Kingston, Ontario, and I've been working here for about 3 years now, although I've been working as a curator for the past 8 years. And today I was invited to talk to you a little bit about a specific subject in medical history, and a subject that's still current today. And we're talking about quackery, so quack medicine. And this is an area that we know quite a lot about here at the museum because we have a huge collection of medical artifacts. Actually, we have the largest in Canada. We have over 40,000 objects in our collection. And we try to share it as much as possible, of course, but we always love to do such presentation because it allows us to do a little bit more history about these wonderful objects. And you can see actually some of them in display at the museum if you ever come in Kingston. And if you ever want to know more, please come by. So anyway, we'll start the presentation right away. So let me just share my presentation with you. So here we go. So quack medicine, so a history of the world's oldest tricks. So what is exactly quackery? So when we talk about quack medicine, well, there's a few definitions that we use today. So I've took two of the most, I think, relatable definitions that you can find in dictionaries now. So we talk about dishonest practices and claims to have special knowledge and skill in some field, typically medicine, of course. Or a quack is a fraudulent or ignorant pretender to medical skill, or a person who pretends professionally or publicly to have skill, knowledge, qualification, or credentials he or she does not possess. And so those are some interesting things about it, you know. So you can be a quack because you're being dishonest, you're trying to fraud, trying to basically steal from clients or from patients, but you can also be ignorant. So you can be pretending that you're a doctor when in fact you're not, but you can also pretend that you know, some kind of medicine works when in fact it doesn't, but you just don't know better because you don't have the knowledge to know. So there's many ways to look at this. And the issue when we talk about quack medicine is often, where do we draw the line? Where does quack medicine begins? Where does it end? What do we consider to be quack? So of course, if somebody tried to use 19th century medicine on me today, I would probably call him a quack, right? Because we know that a lot of the theories that were used back then, like bloodletting, for example, are not really medically sound today. But if we talk about a doctor from the 19th century, can we call him a quack? Because he's using the same technique, the same knowledge. So it's tricky, right? Because at the time, he would not have been considered a quack in his field because he was a trained doctor and he was working with the best knowledge that was available to him. And that's very important to understand, right? That knowledge continually evolves, and that doctors even today work with the best techniques, the best science that's available to them, but it might change. You know, things that we take for granted today might actually be considered wrong in the future, and that's always important to acknowledge. So, where does quackery comes from? Often we link quackery with patent medicine. So it's important to note that patent medicine appeared in the 17th century. So they appeared at a time when royal noblemen, kings were giving patent letters to quacks, or to at least medical peddlers. So they were letter patents were basically early forms of copyright. So the king was giving you a letter saying, this man here has the right to market this product, and nobody else can claim the ownership of this remedy. So that it began to appear in the 17th century. That's also when you start hearing quack in the English language for the first time. So quack actually comes from the Old Dutch and means to boast. So you see, as you see here on your screen, there's this typical kind of snake oil dealers, we call them today, selling his products on the street, of course, probably boasting about their effects, and being quite the showman about it, right? But in the 19th century, that's really, so in the 1800s, that's really where patent medicine really rose in popularity. So why exactly? First off, because they were cheaper than doctors. Of course, in the 1800s, until actually very, very recently in our history in Canada, if you wanted to see the doctor, you needed to pay out of your own pocket. So the doctor would come to your house, and he would try to treat you the best he could, and he would give you a bill, and you had to pay him. Same thing if you went to the hospital. So a few hospitals were offered free care for people who were considered poor, but the treatment was not necessarily always the best. So if you didn't have the money to pay your doctor, probably you would buy patent medicine because it was simply cheaper. Also, reputations of doctors and hospitals were not so great in the 19th century. So people didn't quite understand yet the theory of germs. So this created a lot of issues, right? So you went to the hospital and you could actually get sick. And people kind of noticed this, and they were afraid to go to the hospital or to see the doctor because they considered it was something that you did in the last recourse when you had no other options. And even then, it was probably not the best, even though medicine was advancing at the time. So I'm going to present you some very famous cases of patent medicine throughout history. So the first one I chose it because I really like the logo, but also because it's a very popular type of patent medicine. It's called Radium's Microkiller. And as you see from the logo, it probably works real well, right? Because you have this guy using a bat with nails in it to beat a skeleton, so probably disease or that. And this is trademarked in 1887. So this is a time where the germ theory is just appearing, just being accepted by doctors around the world. So they're saying like, oh, suddenly, okay, so disease comes actually from microbes, from germs that are attacking you from the inside. So you have all these, these sellers, these companies that want to cash in on this new theory. So they release new products that say will kill every microbe around. And you have this Radium's Microkiller that was hugely popular, was invented by somebody who had no medical training at all. But you can still, if you go to antique dealers, you know, today you can still find bottles of Radium's Microkiller sometimes on shelves. And what's really interesting about him is that when his product was finally analyzed by scientists, they discovered that the composition of Radium's Microkiller was actually 99% water and traces of sulfuric acid and ash. So probably not the most effective medicine you could buy. The next one is kind of an original one. So this is Duffys pure malt whiskey. So you might be surprised to see whiskey as a medicine, but for a very long time, actually, alcohol was considered medicine. And people would be prescribed alcohol, wine, gin to treat different ailments. But by the late 19th century, it was more and more considered to be quack. But there were still companies advertising their products as medicine. And Duffy was one of them. And you can see that they were making some rather bold claims, like this senior lady here was apparently 106 years old, and that's because she drinks Duffy's pure malt whiskey, of course, every day. Of course, we know today that drinking alcohol every day or whiskey every day is probably going to create more problems than it solves. But the company came under very high scrutiny by the 1900s, and a lot of people sued the company actually because they were making false claims, such as this one. Also, something you hear about a lot when people talk about patent medicine is, of course, snake oil. So snake oil has become synonymous with quack medicine. And it's got a really interesting history that still is actually current today. It's still studied today. So snake oil, back in the day, was advertised as being a traditional indigenous medicine. So sellers were going around town selling it, were advertising it as such. But actually, when you look at the history, it came from the first Chinese immigrants that came to America. And they actually used Chinese water snake oil to make these products. And it was used to mostly to fight rheumatism, muscle ache, joint pain, all these things. So you would rub it on your skin and it would treat whatever you had. But the people who basically stole the recipe and started marketing it completely changed it. So they were using mostly alcohol, rubbing alcohol, and camphor, which had very little effect, of course, on your muscle ache. So it gave a very bad name to snake oil, but there's people actually researching snake oil today and finding out that there might actually be some truth to the original recipe, because Chinese water snake does contain some elements that can fight muscle pain. Some of them were also maybe were effective actually, but maybe a little bit too much. So you have two famous examples here. I'm going to talk about the one on the right first. So Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. So it was created in 1842 and was hugely popular. They were selling about 2 million bottles a year in its heyday. As you see, about 1.50 shillings per bottle. And this was given to children who were teething or were having problems sleeping. And what they did not tell their clients was that Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup actually contained a lot of morphine. And morphine, if you've ever heard about what it is actually a very strong anesthetic or painkiller. And so what was happening is that mothers were giving their babies morphine, which can be highly toxic and even deadly, and unknowingly. And of course it worked. It worked very well for what it was advertising, but it created a lot more problems, and even in some cases, some babies died. Also, you have the cocaine toothache drops. So cocaine was created a little bit later on in the 19th century, And they found out very quickly that it was very good to treat pain, but they also found very quickly that it was highly addictive. And it could also create severe conditions if you took it even a little bit. So they still sold cocaine as a way to treat pain, even for children, as you see here. So that was two famous cases of these. Also, another product that you might actually take today, Coca-Cola. So some of you may have heard about this, but Coca-Cola used to contain actual coca leaves. So from where cocaine, for the cocaine tooth drops were actually made. And as you can see, was advertised for treating headaches, mental and physical exhaustion. So they stopped using coca around 1903 because they were coming under very strict scrutiny. And as you'll see later on, there was quite an uproar later as people were realizing that a lot of medicine that they were buying were actually highly dangerous and addictive. So this is a cartoon I really like. This is about a pharmacy, so an imaginary pharmacy that's called the Kill 'em Quick pharmacy. And you can see the pharmacist on the right is selling bracers. So this is like Coca-Cola, for example, to his adult clients who are all addicted, and they're running to get this new product, and selling even soothing syrup to kids. And you have the barman sitting on the left side who's saying, I can compete with this kind of addiction. So the public were realizing more and more that there was a big problem. More and more people were becoming addicted. This was creating problems, poverty, illness, even death. So there was this very famous investigation in 1905 by Colliers magazine, and they released a study about patent medicine and what it really contained. Because what is important to know is that there was no law at the time that required you to be honest about the effects of your product or even to name your ingredients. So as long as you were not purposefully trying to kill your patients, you could put whatever you wanted. So Colliers actually had scientists look at the contents, and they issued this article saying this is a very big problem. This is creating debt, this is creating poverty, and the governments have to step up and do something. And this is what the Canadian government did in 1908. They enacted some laws saying, they were very simple actually, they had to simply name your ingredients on the bottle that you were selling. And once people realized how many dangerous ingredients there were in these products, the sales fell rapidly, dramatically. So it really made a big change in how people viewed medicine back in the day. Now, there were also other types of quackery. One very famous is called Electro Quackery. So Electro Quackery is, of course, using electricity, which was a very new thing in the 19th century, was becoming more and more accessible to people. And some people are saying, well, we can maybe use electricity to treat different ailments. And this is a very famous type of Electro Quackery that's called violet ray therapy. So they had this machine that was creating actually ozone and a very slight electrical current. And they were advertising this machine as treating everything from colds, from backaches, acne, everything. And of course, as many other of those products, it was they quickly realized that it did none of those things. There were also very other famous cases of electric equipment that supposedly contained electric batteries, when in fact all they were containing was pepper paste. So you'd have a little burn on your skin, and you'd think, oh, there's electricity that's going through, but in fact it was just the red pepper paste that was slightly burning your skin. Where people believing this is that people did not understood electricity, how it worked at the time. So as people became more knowledgeable, they were getting harder and harder to fool, hopefully. Also, other very strange ideas. When radium was invented, so you might have heard about Marie Curie and her husband Pierre Curie that found this element, radium, in the early 1900s. And it was also found that radium could treat certain types of cancer. But what they didn't realize at first was that it could cause cancer as well if you use it too much. But people jumped on the idea and they started including radium in every kind of products. So as you see here in beauty creams, so you could use radium beauty creams on you that would give you a glowing, radiating face, probably actually literally. Also, you have radium infused water. So you have water dispensers that contain actually radium, and were very bad cases of cancer that actually came from the use of those products. And we have in our collection actually water radium crock that's on display that you can come and see here in Kingston. Also, X-rays were very popular. Once they were discovered in 1895, people again started using it within a year in every kind of treatments, from treating tuberculosis, acne. So they would shoot X-rays at you. And of course, today we know that X-rays can be dangerous if they're used for too long or too often. And that's why if you go to the hospital to get an X-ray, you'll get a very, very small amount. And of course, you'll be protected. So it's not dangerous in the way that it's used today. But back in the day, people had no idea of the dangers that it could cause. And just to finish quickly this presentation, so we've just seen a few famous examples of quackery. But sometimes we wonder, is it all gone? It's easy to think that this is all in the past, and maybe this is not affecting us anymore because we're more knowledgeable. We have science, and everything is progressing, getting better. But they're still existing. There's still people who are selling quack products, and the way that they do it is actually by using careful wording. So instead of calling, for example, their medicine, they'll call it nutritional supplement. So that's ways to get around some of the laws that are in place. And this is a very, necessarily very famous, but this came up in the news very recently. This is a product to repel psychic vampires. Not sure exactly what it is, but this is sold by a very famous actress. I won't name anyone, but you can Google it if you like. And this was in the news recently that this is actually sold for quite a good amount online. So always exercise your critical sense when you're being subjected to new ideas that seem too good to be true. And always be careful about what you buy or what you're being suggested. So I hope you like this very short presentation. There I could talk about quackery for hours. There's tons of other really interesting stories to be told about this, but we have a very short time today. So I hope you like this little presentation, and I'll be free to answer your questions if you have any.
Well, thank you so much. I was kind of laughing silently here at how it all seems so silly now, and it always makes me wonder, 100 years from now, what is it that we assume to be correct, as you said, that our children's children will look back and say, oh, how did they not know? So it will be interesting to see if we uncover any of those things in our lifetimes. For
Absolutely.
now, I'll just ask you to click the stop share button at the top of your screen. And I will pass along our first question from Annika in Comox Valley, British Columbia. She would like to know if pretending that you are a doctor and selling quack medicine now is illegal.
So I'm not a doctor today, and I'll try to insert this as best as I can. But the short answer is yes, it is illegal. So you cannot advertise yourself as being a doctor if you do not have a medical license. You could advertise yourself as being a doctor in different ways. For example, if I did a PhD in Roman history, I would be technically a doctor. I wouldn't be a physician. I would be a surgeon, but I could absolutely put the words doctor next to my name. And if nobody ever looked at my credentials, at the education I had, well, maybe they say, well, he's a doctor. No, that's right next to his name, DR, doctor. So I can trust him. So you always have to go a little bit beyond to know if people are really telling the truth or if they're just being a little bit crafty about presenting themselves.
Interesting. Critical thinking skills, again, cropping up.
Yes.
So why is it important to talk about the history of healthcare?
So it's a question I get very often, and people say, well, why should we talk about old types of therapies and medicine when we're creating new treatments all the time? And well, a very simple way to look at this is, we always say, if you don't know where you're coming from, how do you know where you're going or how to get there? And that's a very valid thing. Today, you might have heard people saying, well, maybe we should change our healthcare system. Maybe it's costing too much. Maybe we should go back to a more private care healthcare system where we don't have to pay taxes, but we just pay insurance or pay the doctor when we have to. And if you don't know the history of healthcare, if you don't know how healthcare was administered or was given prior to the current system that we have, you can't really debate it because you're missing a big part of that information. Again, I hope that my presentation today was kind of a proof of the importance of healthcare history, because as you've seen, sure, we've been a long way, but we can still fall prey to the same kind of people that want our money and using the same tricks, just reworded differently. Or when we're talking about vaccination, for example, it's really easy today to dismiss vaccination. But when you look at history, when you look at the time when people did not have vaccines, you have a different perspective on the issue. So I think these are ways in which healthcare history is very relevant, very important today.
That makes a lot of sense. We've also had some advanced questions come in, and in particular, Ms. Patterson's class in Priestville, Saskatchewan wanted to know how you became interested in being a curator and what kind of training did you need to do?
So I became interested in being a curator. I'm not sure exactly what age I was. I was probably 5 or 6 years old or something like this. And my parents brought me to museums quite a lot. And I became really interested in museums from that young age. And I started telling my parents I want to build a museum at the end of the street. And you'll see I'll put all these things in there. And of course, they found this very cute, very funny. And later on, when I was in high school, I loved history. I love hearing about all the different things that people did in the past. And once I went to college, I decided, you know what, I want to really make this dream happen. And I decided to go and study archaeology. And once I finished archaeology, I decided that I would do a master in museum studies. So museum studies is a program that that actually aimed at museum workers. So it helps you in different areas that you have to work in once you're in a museum. So managing collections, building exhibits, making even presentation or research about the objects and the history that you have. The way you become a curator can be can come from many things. It's not like being a doctor, for example. You don't have to go to a specific school or do a specific course to become a curator. You can do a PhD in a different field of history. You can do a master in museum studies. So there's very different ways of doing this, and it's a really rewarding field. I think it allows you to work with old objects, but also discover some really interesting stories. The part I really love about my job is that I learn new things every day, all the time.
Excellent. We have our next question coming from Annalise in Comox Valley, British Columbia. She'd like to know if there were more truth tellers than quack doctors in the 20th century.
So, well, that's an interesting. So, truth tellers. I guess you're talking about maybe regular doctors. Were there more of them than quacks? It's a very difficult question to answer because we don't really have numbers. Nobody ever took the time to make a list of all the quacks that there were, and even then, it would be hard to say, again, who was a quack, who was simply, selling family remedies. At a certain point, it was, every family had their own folk remedies. And you probably have heard some from your grandfathers or from your parents, put some, when you have a cold, put some mustard on you, or, drink some peppermint oil or something. So those are all old folk remedies. And some people might say it's quack, and some people might say, no, it's very valid, and there's some truth to this. So yeah, it's a very hard question to answer. There would have definitely been less doctors than there are today because there were not a lot of schools that could teach medicine. But were there more quacks? Hard to say.
It seems like, generally speaking, when you're looking back into history, the records that people kept were not quite as diligent as what we do today.
Absolutely, and it was very easy to lose a lot of those records. Even recently, people have been throwing away records that would have gave us some really useful information, but at the time they did not thought that it was useful to keep it, so they just throw it away. And that's always heartbreaking for historians like myself. So, sorry, Stacey, I think I didn't quite hear you. I think you're on mute or something right now. Sorry.
It is I who is sorry.
Okay.
Yes, last question for today. What does a curator do? So what does your workday typically look like? So
talking generally, curators can do a lot of things. It always depends on the museum they're working for. So some people, they will work for a very small museum and they can do everything from paying the bills, making sure that people get guided tours, taking care of collections. So everything that usually big museums would have done by different people is done by just the curator. In my case, I take care of research. I supervise the work of our collections manager, who manages the objects themselves and the loans to other museums. So I do research about these objects, and I also make sure that we can get money to make those exhibits and those projects happen. And I also build exhibits. So whenever there's a new exhibit happening, I'm a bit like I would say, a movie director. So I make sure that everything is going smoothly. I have this vision in my head of what the exhibit should be like. So I work with designers, I work with contractors and different people to make sure that this plan I have about the exhibit takes shape. So yeah, I think I like to compare it to movie directors, and I think that's mostly what I would be doing.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. Someone has to bring it all together.
Yes.
So that is all the time we have today. Thank you so much, Maxime, for joining us today and giving us a sort of a brief history of quackery and medicine 100 years ago, and for answering our questions today.
No problem. I hope you all liked it, and thanks for having me.
And join us again for more PIR live events, including our next webinars on sustainable forestry and mental health. More information and a full schedule are available at pirweb.org. Have a great day, everyone.